The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated economies and people's well-being worldwide. Hence, our topic in this side event for the UN High Political Forum. As you see in this slide, our topic is achieving decent work for resilient and sustainable recovery from COVID-19, contributions of humanitarian work psychology to the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development for all populations. Our wonderful speakers this morning will address what you see here in this slide. That's the topic. And what you're going to hear about is in this next slide. What you're going to see is a graphic here, and it shows the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN agenda in the middle, and economic growth and decent work, SDG 8 up top there, that is interlinked with target 3.4 that you see there also to promote mental health and well-being, and also SDG 1, and that's to end poverty. That's of course the UN priority. And with SDG 16, one of our speakers will address about peace and security. So this whole interlinkage is what we are going to be addressing all around decent work and economic development. So thanks to our sponsors, the International Association of Applied Psychology, the Society for Organizational Psychology, both professional psychological organizations, and the management company Org Vitality, and to our backbone producers here today, Amanda Dundas and Joel Zinsu. I'm your moderator, Dr. Judy Kuriansky. I'm an NGO representative for the International Association of Applied Psychology to the United Nations and a psychology professor at Columbia University Teachers College. All our speakers are leaders in the world of work. Some are psychologists and some are in the private sector, but they're all innovators. So we turn first to Dr. Stuart Carr, coming to us from New Zealand, a very good friend and professor of psychology at Massey University in Auckland, New Zealand, who founded the field that I mentioned earlier about humanitarian work psychology, which promotes decent work and well-being as a roadmap to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But you can see that because Stu has a demonstration of the circle of the Sustainable Development Goals in his background. That's very creative already of you, Stu. So explain to us, yes, explain to us what a living wage is, because that's Stu's innovation and very important for our topic today. Stu.
Kia ora, Judy. Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa. Good day, everybody from Auckland and New Zealand. It's humbling to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen. Judy, if you can stop sharing, then
I will.
Get mine up. Yeah. That should be good now. People should be able to see, yeah? Yeah. Thank you, Judy, for that. Yeah, I'm here representing a large group of researchers actually in Project GLOW, which stands for Global Living Organizational Wage. And that's a 26-country network of humanitarian work psychologists and people from a range of disciplines actually looking at the links between wages and living wages in particular, and sustainable development and sustainable livelihoods through the lens, for example, of well-being. I'm going to talk a little bit about wage and well-being for sustainable livelihoods. And I'd like to start by looking back at wages before, during, and after COVID-19. Before COVID-19, we know that the world's workforce of 3.3 billion, 2/3 of those were actually in the informal sector, poorly paid, irregularly paid, insecurely paid very often, and they were struggling to make the ends meet, many of them. Of the remaining third in the formal sector, most with the social protection of legal minimum wages were also struggling. We know that up to 60% of those were reporting that they were struggling to make the ends meet. We know that during the pandemic, there's been downward pressure on wages, especially those of the more precariously employed. And we know that that pressure has been inequitable. It's been hitting women, young people, ethnic minorities more than others. And we know that after we come out of this pandemic, and hopefully that'll be soon, the ILO in the Global Wage Report was calling for setting adequate wage levels through a balanced and evidence-based approach. And that's something very much that the humanitarian work psychology approach is endeavoring to do through Project GLOW. I'm going to ask the audience to share a metaphor here, a conceptual lens, if you like, a wage, well-being spectrum. It's a simple image, but I think it says quite a lot. People go to work, they expect to get a wage, and they don't go there just for the money, but the money is important because it's a means to an end. And the wage that they get actually is a bit like a spectrum in terms of well-being, because the wage that you get can change the color of your life in many ways through your well-being and your sustainable livelihood. And that image of a spectrum is very important because it also suggests the idea of thresholds. So if we look at that spectrum, the difference can be made going from one color to another by crossing a threshold. And thresholds is something that Project GLOW has been looking at. In work psychology, we call the setting of thresholds job evaluation. It's one of the oldest areas in work psychology. And when we look at what's been happening during the pandemic, we saw that people, frontline workers, were being applauded in the street. And that was a form of job evaluation where people were saying, well, you know, we're recognizing that you're doing a very valuable job for society, for people, but you're often not terribly well paid. People now are saying, okay, applause is enough. We want more concrete measures. And perhaps they're saying we want a more humanitarian, maybe work-centered way of setting key wages. If we look at the way wages have been set in that manner, for example, around minimum wages, which is the legal minimum, we see that it's often in the form it's often an econometric calculation, not always, but often, and it's in the form of a singularity. So it's a single number. It's a dollar number very often, or some other currency. And then what happens is that wage may be implemented, and then an argument ensues. It's an unresolved argument in many ways. Proponents will say that it's not high enough, and opponents will say that it is too high. And we've ended up in a bit of an impasse, and we have a bit of a controversy around minimum and living wages in many countries around the world, including here in New Zealand. A humanitarian work psychology approach would say, let's approach this somewhat differently. And it's a complementary approach. It's not trying to displace existing approaches. It would say, let's plot the relationship between variations in worker wages and well-being, because wages vary, they're not singularities, and so does well-being. And then we look at what kind of wages already sustaining livelihoods and possibly shared prosperity, because we know if you're looking after people's well-being, you tend to get higher engagement from the research, and that can create efficiency gains, which means what the UN is calling shared prosperity. So actually the approach is saying, let's look at what's actually out there naturally occurring, and we might be able to see some of those thresholds. We might be able to use the relationship between wage and well-being to induct those critical thresholds. Here's an example from New Zealand. New Zealand was the first country in the world to implement minimum wages in 1894. In 2018, in 2017, the incoming government in New Zealand pledged to raise minimum wages, which we've seen many people are struggling with, from $16 an hour, around about there, up to $20 an hour in 2021. And they've done that in April 2021 this year. They pledged to do that despite the pandemic, and they held to their pledge. In 2018 and 2020, our Marsden-funded Royal Society of New Zealand project on living wages was able to conduct a survey of 1,000 lower-paid New Zealanders across the country, national sample, before the pandemic struck, and also in 2020, when New Zealand had just been through its most severe form of lockdown. And we plotted the relationship, which you'll see on the right-hand side there. And if you, on the bottom there, you've got the hourly wage rate. You've got the Plimsoll line on the left, which is the water line. And you can see that people on the minimum wages are actually just on that water line. They're struggling to make the ends meet. And what you see in both instances, the red line is 2020 and the blue line is 2018. You see basically that there's a working poverty trap. People at the bottom end of the spectrum are struggling to make ends meet. The interesting thing about that poverty trap is that it's shorter in 2020, not in 2018. And you can see the graphs move to the right as the wage has been increased, but you're also seeing that there's a smaller poverty trap, fewer people caught in working poverty. And when we ask people, are you making ends meet? A larger number said in 2020 than in 2018 that they were, showing that the policy, I think, is starting to work, and showing us a way that you can actually track what kind of wage makes a difference to people's well-being through policy change, through and hopefully out of this pandemic. Let's move on now to living wage, which Judy mentioned. A living wage is not a legal wage in many cases. It's more of a voluntary decision by organizations. It's typically set higher than the minimum wage, which is a subsistence wage. It's a wage that's higher and enables theoretically a higher quality of work life and well-being and life generally. And this pattern that we see on the left-hand side, the curve, resembles the one I showed just now from New Zealand. But what we see in this graph is typical of graphs we're seeing from South Africa, from New Zealand, from China, also recently from Thailand and Philippines. It shows, I want to draw your attention to the two intersection points on the graph. At the bottom left of the green line is the minimum wage. And that's where as people cross that minimum wage line, the things start to look up a little bit, but they're still struggling. And they only start to actually come above that waterline at the second point of intersection, which is a living wage. And it's more attuned with well-being, and that's the living wage threshold that one can identify through this kind of approach. On the right-hand side, we have a table, exemplar study from New Zealand. We've been asking people along this curve to give us their stories about how well their wage is working for them and their well-being. And you can see in the box on the right, that's somebody saying, we were at the minimum wage, we're now at the living wage, and we're now managing to enjoy a certain quality of life and well-being. That's somebody that's looking down the wage where they've been, and they've crossed into another color of life, a transformation. And this is a job evaluation that's human-centered, worker-centered, and enables us to sort of identify where the living wage may be. And in actual fact, it turns out that the two intersection points on the graph, the lower one in New Zealand and other places, certain other countries, is round about the legal minimum. And the second intersection where things really change and look up is round about the campaign living wage, certainly here in New Zealand. Okay, so let's move now from living wages to maximum wages. We've seen minimum implies maximum, yeah? And we've seen around the world over the past few decades rising wealth, income, and wage inequality. Work psychologists tend to focus on the latter. You can have an income without having a job and a wage. We focus more on wage inequality. In antiquity, this is not a new idea, a maximum wage. It's been around in antiquity. Plato, for example, is reputed to have said to Aristotle, the top wage should never be more than 5 times the bottom wage in any community. That's the wage ratio. In 2013, the ILO, in a bold World of Work report, put forward this idea of wage ratios and being recognized as a form of braking mechanism for runaway wage inequality. And it is in a very clever way, because if you're at that CEO end of the wage spectrum and you want to raise the wage there, you need to raise the wage of all the workers, because the ratio has to stay the same. So it creates positive interdependence between people and wages. Let's be clear here. We're talking about breadcrumbs at one end of the table and feasts at the other. There are cases of excess. They're not always excessive, but there are. And this is about redistributing a little bit so that there's more equity in the wage well-being spectrum. We know from past pandemics that the public tolerance for these big wage gaps gets shorter, and that may well be happening at the present moment. And we know that that's likely to be even shorter when we have intersecting gender, racial justice, social, economic, socio-political, and environmental crises. So just to finish, the curve on the right, which is borrowed from Davis's J-curve theory, is saying maybe we should be looking as well now at the maximum minimum wage ratio and its relationship to sustainability of livelihoods through well-being. And we may be approaching a point where we need to start setting those thresholds and researching them much more. And that started, but it needs to accelerate. So just to conclude, I'm arguing, or we're arguing in GLOW, we can apply humanitarian job evaluation to set wage range thresholds that are more likely to sustain livelihoods through well-being, and thereby addressing all of the SDGs, all 17 of them. Kia ora koutou, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now. Yeah.
Stu, you lived up to your reputation. Really, you've given us a way out of this drastic economic disaster. You've highlighted this new world of humanitarian work. psychology that's emerging, and you're giving us a new definition of the word glow. Okay.
Thank you, Judy.
So to elaborate, and it's evident in your background, elaborate on this issue of decent work and how we get out of this emerging recovery, hopefully. We turn now to Jeff Saltzman. Jeff is an industrial organizational psychologist, which means that he's an expert on work. And he founded the company Org Vitality that does management consulting. And importantly, in reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic, Org Vitality did a survey about employees' reaction to the pandemic, including their fears, all their emotional feelings. And that's now available very free to help companies understand how to best support their workers during those times. And you can find it on their website on orgvitality.com. So I recommend that. Jeff wrote the book, Creating the Vital Organization, Balancing Short-Term Profits with Long-Term Success. So with all that, welcome, Jeff, on the topic of decent work, pandemic impact on workers' expectations. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Judy. It's great to be here. Different than Stuart's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on people generally working in larger organizations, people who are in the formal workplace. But I think you'll find some interesting overlap between the two presentations. So let me start. Much has been speculated about how the pandemic will shape employee expectations about the workplace. And I'll be the first to admit I don't have a crystal ball, but based on history and our humanity, some predictions can be made regarding what is likely to occur. What we see, collected from employee surveys and interviews, is that many of the current patterns in the data are similar to the patterns we saw after 9/11 and during the Great Recession, which began in 2007. But when we look at patterns of data from employees, we have to be careful not to paint with too broad of a brush. While there's a statistical distribution with every trait, truth be told, there are more similarities than differences when it comes to the specifics of what workers want from the world of work. Before I get into those similarities and differences and patterns in the data and how best to respond to them, there's a fundamental tenet I would like to put forth. The underlying human psychology, which drives the fundamentals of what workers want from the workplace, has not changed during this pandemic. It did not change after 9/11, it did not change after the Great Recession, and it's very unlikely to change anytime soon. What does and can change is how those fundamentals are fulfilled. Let me cover a few of those fundamentals to illustrate. First, the sense of equity, that for the effort I put in, I'm given a fair return. That return is measured in terms of compensation and benefits. The benefits can be varied, and then each person will put a different weight on the value of those benefits, such as job prestige, organizational mission, development opportunities, resume building, insurance, flexibility, vacation time, retirement plans, time to retirement, and job security. Many people, for instance, will take a job with lower compensation if they can retire after 20 years with health insurance and a pension. Others will take a job and work under less satisfying conditions if the organization is viewed as serving a higher purpose. What combination people value in terms of compensation and benefits is varied and can and does change over time. Sometimes this is driven by life stage or by impacts of significant events, such as technological advances, economic crises, attacks by foreign actors, or pandemics. So after a pandemic, people still desire equitable treatment, but the factors that create that equitableness can and will change, not necessarily for all, but at least for some. The second fundamental is being treated with respect and dignity. I defy you, and I haven't seen anyone out there in 35 years of looking, I defy you to find a worker anywhere in the world of any generation from any culture that doesn't want to be treated with respect and dignity, pathology aside. This does not change over time and is a constant. Respect and dignity are so often used in conjunction with one another that they've become joined at the hip as a unified concept, not only in the world of work, but also in our day-to-day conceptual thinking as well. Dignity is often defined as a person's freedom to write their own life story. That requires freedom from oppression and has within that notion both rights and obligations. One right is of control over oneself and one's body, and an obligation would be to take responsibility for your behaviors and actions. Maintaining dignity in the world of work, using that definition, is a balancing act. If dignity is about the right to choose, and as one enters an employment situation, one is giving up at least some dignity in that you're working not necessarily to your own ends on your own initiatives, but on organizationally defined goals, and often on an organizationally defined schedule. The third factor is organization effectiveness, which also includes effectiveness of leadership. One of the factors causing people to quit an organization is if they experience frustrations day to day in getting their work done. While there are always exceptions, by and large, people want to work, they want to contribute, and they want to do a good job. One piece of evidence for this is that people who are overworked have higher levels of job satisfaction than people who are not given enough to do, which generates feelings of being less valued. Organization effectiveness has both an internal component, how well is the place being run, and an external component, do we offer products and services that are attractive and of high quality? And a fourth fundamental factor that each employee wants to have is a sense of personal future, a career path, and each is chasing their own personal rainbow. Here's the thing though, no one has ever seen someone else's rainbow. A rainbow is created when a beam of light passes through water droplets, is diffracted, and shines on the color receptors in your eye. When two people look at a rainbow, even if they're standing side by side, they are seeing different rainbows, different light beams passing through different water droplets, reflecting uniquely off the color receptors in their eyes. Their respective rainbows may appear very similar, but as each of us perceives a rainbow, we're perceiving a unique image, an image that no one else perceives. Organizations are constantly looking for their own rainbows, or perhaps more accurately, the mythical pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They create all sorts of messaging to motivate employees to see the same rainbow that the leader at the top of the organization sees. But just as each person needs to see rainbows their own unique way, each employee needs to internalize organizational goals in their own fashion. Employees can get on board with the organizational vision, but just as each of us has a unique vision, our own personal rainbows, each of us will have a unique vision of why we work to achieve the organizational goals, no matter how similar we think it might be. During this pandemic, it'll come as no surprise if I say that stress levels have increased. And while stress levels have been steadily increasing over the past decades, during the pandemic, it would not be unusual to see responses in the mid 80s to mid 90s. In other words, the vast majority of the workforce is very stressed. No surprise, women with either preschool age children or school age children are the most stressed. They're often juggling work, remote schooling, lack of childcare options, canceled after school activities, running a household, and perhaps an aging parent or two. While many organizations are concerned about the stress levels employees are experiencing and trying various strategies, such as closing on a Friday or mandatory vacation time, as we make changes, such as everyone back to the office, the changes themselves can be stress-inducing, even if done with the best of intentions. An organization will not be able to eliminate stress, but it can help employees cope with it. One of the causes of stress is lack of information. The lack of information, along with increased levels of fear, driven by the unknown of a novel disease, increases anxiety. Take anxiety, throw in media reports of panic buying, and you get runs on toilet paper, on milk, eggs, etc. The desire for information is clearly indicated in the data as an insatiable desire, as it reduces the uncertainty and stress people are feeling. Ominously, in the absence of accurate information, people make up their own stories or are open to lies and false information. Employees want to hear the truth, and they want to hear it from the top of the house. You cannot over-communicate to your employees at this point, and they will be grateful for it. In times of uncertainty, the ratings of leadership in terms of trust and confidence improve significantly. In uncertain and fear-inducing situations, effective, decisive leadership, which points to a solution path, is strongly desired. And employees are willing to give leadership the benefit of the doubt, at least until proven otherwise. This is a pattern we've seen over and over. What happens, though, is that organizations rarely, if ever, can hold on to the gains in ratings of leadership as the crisis subsides. In uncertainty, leadership is often more visible, communicates more, giving reassurances where possible, and that visibility and high level of communication dissipates. As it dissipates, so do the enhanced scores. As a leader, be as visible as possible to your folks. Do not simply retreat into the war room to plan out options and contingencies. Talk to them, listen to them. Oftentimes in situations of uncertainty, chaos in the workplace increases. There's a school of thought out there that chaos is a good thing, that it increases innovation and drives higher levels of performance. But be assured it does no such thing. Chaos by definition makes less information available to staff. Chaos is not an organizing principle or a way to achieve a higher level of creativity or performance. It is simply chaos and leads to greater uncertainty. This is not a good time to reorganize or move people around without very good reasons. Reducing chaos by increasing information flow should be the goal. Be as clear as possible about what the organization is doing to cope with the situation and provide as much information as possible regarding the impact on each organizational member. Give people as much agency as possible. This is a path towards increasing dignity. Get people involved in solving problems, give them as much control over their own paths as possible. After 9/11, for instance, those employees who were actively involved in restoring one company's operation located at ground zero saw dramatic increases in satisfaction, pride, and engagement compared to another group not involved at the same company. Work towards restoring or increasing employee confidence. And remember, it's likely that every single one of your employees in one fashion or another has struggled. Confidence can be impacted by improving the way you conduct business, improve the internal processes and relationships, tackle issues that will increase effectiveness, but perhaps have been put off, and do so in a visible, communicative fashion. Reinvigorate the organization's competitiveness. Ensure that your services and products are current and competitive. Communicate to your staff what you're doing to enhance competitiveness. Provide current reassurance. Assure that organizational members can thrive in the current environment. What do they need to be effective, and what special circumstances are they dealing with? Take a long-term view of staff member development and opportunity. The value proposition to employees is to provide skills and experiences that equips them for a meaningful career, not for a specific job. And finally, remember how people react to COVID is not uniform and will vary based on individual differences, and will also be dependent on personal circumstances. What we do know about people is that when they are appropriately supported and feel safe, there's a tremendous amount of resilience and people can bounce back from adversity. Thank you.
My, Jeff, those were fabulous points. Very psychological too, ways for employers to really boost their employees. You said sport, safety, empowering them, giving them control and confidence, and what their personal rainbow is. There's a lot of color besides a lot of intelligence on this panel here. Thank you so much, Jeff. We turn also to a tremendous innovator, another one on our panel, Therese Fitzpatrick, who is serving as the global lead for the implementation of the United Nations Workplace Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy. This is very important. It's been pioneered by the United Nations Secretary General now to serve the mental health needs of the UN staff, which is critical. He's very, very forward-thinking about mental health, and that's what is under Therese's wing now. So the project that she's overseeing, which is a big job when you think about the vast amount of UN personnel who are in posts all over the world. You look up the strategy on the website, Mental Health Matters, a healthy workplace for a better world. And you can also see their poetry book there, and soon there'll be podcasts and online learning. So there's a lot of humanitarians. So Therese, of course, works too with the UN member states group of Friends of Mental Health and Wellbeing that I know very well, having founded it with Ambassador Otto of Palau, co-chaired now by Canada, Bahrain, Belgium, and Ecuador. So she is really integrating the member states with the workers. And with all that, Therese is perfect to address her topic of mental health and well-being of personnel during COVID and beyond. Thank you, Therese. Love you. Oh, Therese, wait, the innovation of Therese. Look at her background. Tell us about that before you go in a few words. Come on, it's so colorful. It's just like all our, that Jeff just mentioned about color.
Judy, it's always a pleasure to work with you, and I would love to take credit for my background, but the true innovators I'm working with are known as our young superstars, who are the interns who work on my team. They are absolute superstars, and one of them designed this as well as all of the work in our poetry book, which I can share with you all.
Great, thanks. Very.
So I'm good at getting the innovators around me to make myself look colourful.
Okay.
So thank you for the introduction, Judy. So yeah, so I thought it would be useful today, having heard about all of the different research around what is really helping people at the moment, to think about, to have a practical example about what we're actually doing across the UN system. And as Judy alluded to, it's a very large system. It's a very complex system working in all countries of the world. So we're really, the timing, I think, was quite incredible, that the mental health strategy was launched in 2018, towards the end of 2018. We commenced work on that in 2019, which meant we were well placed when COVID hit to really think about how can we pivot and support personnel across the globe. The survey was actually, the strategy was started after a survey done in 2015, which showed that UN personnel reported symptoms consistent with a mental health condition at a higher rate than the general population, and that it actually, that those rates increased the longer personnel worked at the UN. And there's obviously a whole range of reasons for that. And we can share the survey results, but I didn't want to go into them today because I want to talk more about what we're doing about that. So we saw that there was an issue. The Secretary General stepped up and developed obviously endorsed the strategy. And really, it is really important that we're thinking about the health and well-being of UN personnel, because we can't make the world a better place unless we are healthy ourselves. So in the words of our Secretary General, let us all be part of a healthier workplace as we work for a better world for all. So it benefits us, it benefits the world, and it also is an opportunity for us to learn about what works, so we can be contributing to the knowledge base in this area as well. There's 4 key themes of the strategy, and I just wanted to outline this because it gives you a sense that it is quite a broad strategy. So it is looking at how do we create a workplace that enhances mental and physical health and well-being for all. So really having a strong prevention approach. How can we look at the risks? How can we mitigate those risks? You can imagine working within the UN. I mean, many locations we can't take away those risks, but we can think about how we're creating a workplace that really gets the best out of all of our personnel. The second key theme is around developing, delivering and continuously evaluating mental health and wellbeing services in all duty stations. So we have a number of mental health services that are available. We need to continue to look at that to make sure there is equal access for UN personnel, no matter where they work in the world. And as you can imagine, over the last 12 months, there has been quite a shift in terms of that as we move to more telehealth, as we look at our insurers, as we have a more agile approach to how we can approach psychological and mental health support. The third key theme is around welcoming and supporting staff who live with mental health challenges, and that is both from ensuring we're reducing stigma, but also to make sure we've got the policies and procedures in place to support staff when they are experiencing a mental health condition. The fourth area is around ensuring sustainable funding for implementation of the strategy, and to make sure that is sustainable over time. So this becomes just the way we work. So that, because it was originally a 5-year strategy, of which we're about the halfway mark now. So as I mentioned, we started work in 2019. We were putting the structures in place, and then in March 2020, we paused and really started to think about what are the needs of our staff now. And it was interesting to hear the previous speaker, particularly around communication. We did do a survey last year, and the top thing that came up around how can we support mental health and wellbeing was around communication. And that's just not just communication around mental health, but transparent communication as much as possible, given the level of uncertainty, to ensure that so personnel understood what was happening, understood what changes were happening, and understood how we would be working into the future. So it did require quite an agile response from the UN. So looking at our policies, looking at our flexible working arrangements. How could we support personnel if they were supporting children at home, if they were looking after elderly parents? Everybody had different needs over this time, so flexibility was absolutely key. We did a health and wellbeing survey, as I mentioned. That was undertaken by 13 UN organisations, and it did show that there was variability across different organisations and different duty stations. But it allowed us to think about who were the people most at risk. And one of the key things that really stood out for me as part of that was that it was our young personnel. So any of the age groups below 45 were experiencing poorer levels of wellbeing throughout that period. So it made us think about how can we provide more support for so younger personnel who've obviously had their social lives particularly disrupted and were feeling quite isolated, as well as young parents looking after children. We did a lot of work around access to psychosocial support, and that varies across UN organisations, but pivoting around our insurance providers, looking at external providers when we needed it, and also increasing the number of counsellors available across the UN system. We were also mindful of the increased risk around domestic abuse, which was across the world, but obviously the UN personnel are not immune to that. So we did a lot of work around how can we support personnel experiencing domestic abuse. We worked with an external organisation to launch a global directory, with the first of its kind, where it actually had resources within nearly every country across the world, so people can go and find out what support is available within that country. We also did a lot of work around World Mental Health Month. So obviously it's normally a day, we turned it into a month, and we had different themes across each week of October, focusing on what other organisations were doing, so we could learn from that, looking at getting a number of personnel to talk about their personal experiences, looking at how can we work with people particularly at risk. So with people experiencing domestic abuse, people with a disability, we partner with UN Globe, which is our LGBTIQ network across the system, and also Young UN. So really starting to think about how can we support all the different groups who are more at risk. So we did a lot of work around communication, getting the information out there. That was also where the poetry book came in. We asked UN personnel to submit their poetry. We got over 50 poems written by UN personnel from 20 countries in 7 languages. And it's actually quite beautiful to see people talking about their experiences in poetry form. And again, all of this is on our website as along with the video of the launch of that event. So where to from here? We're really in that transition phase now, as we are thinking about how can we sustain this over time. So we're working on an implementation guide. So every UN organisation has a mental health action plan and is reporting on that. We're doing a lot of work for leaders and managers, because we know it's such a difficult time for them to know how to support staff. And I'm going to share the links of that in a moment. We're doing a lot of work around training and resources, and a lot of this is about minimising duplication of effort. So there is a lot of work that's happening across the UN system, and we're really working to make sure that we're sharing those resources with across UN organisations, to make sure we're not all developing the same resources and they're available to all personnel. We've also recently launched another global health survey, which is actually it's around all issues around health and wellbeing. There's 20 UN organisations taking part in that, and it's one of the biggest surveys we've looked at, to make sure we're really focusing our policies, focusing our efforts, so we're supporting UN personnel and we know where the issues are. We're looking at some of the administrative issues that make things difficult for people who are experiencing a mental health condition, and not looking at wholesale changes, but are there small things we can do that can make a big difference to personnel, particularly when they are needing to take time off due to mental health issues. Lastly, really working on integration. So there's a whole range of different strategies across the UN. For example, currently within the Secretariat, there's an anti-racism task force to make sure we are supporting all staff and to make sure that there are no issues in terms of racism. And obviously that is linked to mental health as well. So making sure that we are integrating with other strategies, that mental health is considered within all of the work that we do. And you can start to see that shift. I think that now people come to me and say, I'm doing some work on this. I think it's related to mental health. Can we work together? So working in a much more integrated way. Just finally, and I can share in the chat, we've got a range of resources that are available no matter where you are. We have a number of fact sheets and podcasts in all of the UN official languages. And there's give you an idea of some of the sort of fact sheets we're working on. So why is mental health important? How can you improve mental health and wellbeing, thriving as a leader and manager? And then also we move on to supporting staff experiencing mental health condition, because we know that if UN leaders are able to look after their own mental health and wellbeing, that's great for them, it's great for their team, and it's great for the world. Here are all of our contact details. We're on social media, we've got email, and I do encourage you to have a look at our website. There's a whole range of different information in there that is freely available for anybody who would like to use it within their organisation. So thank you, Judy.
Oh my, Teresa, really, you're presenting to us a model, really, of how organizations can really move forward in helping the mental health of their workers. It's brilliant. You start with the Secretary General, who we honor for really bringing mental health to the fore, which he's doing, creating this strategy, and you implementing it in this really brilliant way with all these examples, taking technology, including that Walter and I were very happy to be one on the first webinars on the World Mental Health Day. And then you're bringing art into it through poetry, really getting to people's hearts where they live, you know, and also in person, because I remember, you know, being in the lobby at the UN and people being amazed that you were there to really, you know, and I was, and several of our other colleagues, to care about people one-to-one. It's really brilliant and innovative as a model. Innovation of all of these speakers is really amazing. And Paul Dommel, who's next as our speaker, is also on the cutting edge. He's in the private sector at IBM, where he is the global director for public service and civil development, so civil government, which is other than defense. And it addresses education and development. And notably, he works with populations like veterans to prevent tragic suicide, which is so important. We're going to hear about that. Paul has worked all around the world, in the US, Asia Pacific, in the Europe and Latin America. So he knows all the cultures, like Therese was just talking about, and combines his knowledge of technology, we were talking about, expertise about work, and commitment to mental health. So for his talk on trauma, the pandemic, and the return to work, what's the role of technology? Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Judy. What a great panel. Really excited to be part of it. So, you know, look, mental fitness underpins our ability to work well. And right now, there's really a mismatch between the need for services and access to services. And my talk is focused on, I'm going to give some examples of how tech can help to address that gap. And you know, just this week, I live in Virginia in the United States. On Friday, unfortunately, our state had to shut down access for new admissions to state mental health hospitals and clinics. And the reason was because there's 30% of openings in staff. 108 frontline staff workers in those hospitals have quit in the last 2 weeks because so much stress is on them. And so it's a real tangible example for me of just stress in the general system of mental health. And I think the pandemic highlighted 4 challenges, and we touched on some of these during the call this morning. There's a growing demand for services, and you know, Therese is working on the fact that this is not a UN statistic, it's just a general statistic that 40% of employees have had a mental health issue, and 63% of them have never discussed it with an employer, and it affects how their fitness and their readiness for work. It's a real economic cost. It's $1 trillion a year plus off of the global economy. And when you look at the future of the workforce, more stress coming because, you know, especially in the sort of the bottom and the middle parts of the workforce, 50% of workers are going to need to be reskilled by 2025. And so, and combine that also, I think, Jeff talked a little bit about declining confidence in our institutions, whether it's government or our employers. There's a lot going on here. But technology, the convergence of technology is really, it's not an answer. There is no great, easy answer for this stuff, but I think technology is changing fast and there is a real role for it. So there are virtual assistants, and we use those all the time to help people find support, get answers to easy questions, and point them in the right direction. These are new capabilities that just in the last few years and over the pandemic have really started exploding. We can really use technology to personalize solutions to help to understand an individual better and structure programs that work for them. And I think we're really much better at understanding the importance of super high levels of security and privacy for this in order to build trust and confidence in the system. So just a couple of examples that I'm going to point to. One of the big challenges of veterans around the world, and in the US is no exception, is that some of our veterans really struggle with the transition from military life to civilian life, from that transition from a structured, regimented life in the military to finding and fitting in the workforce. And unfortunately, there's a very high suicide rate. It's double the suicide rate in the first few years after leaving than it is in the general society. In fact, it's more prevalent among women veterans than it is among men veterans. And so we're working with just an example of work that's being done. The Department of Veterans Affairs in the US is starting from the fact that we're going to help our people make that transition. We're going to give them tools to help with mental fitness, to understand where they are, to help with a job search, to connect to peers, and to have a mental health hotline. So in this particular example, we IBM, but there are other companies, lots of other companies that are doing this. They're just examples. Working with a company called Total Brain, which does work with mental fitness and measurements and works with corporations on the fitness of their teams. So to assess, to come up with a baseline of an individual. We do job search support. The biggest stressor for veterans, one of the biggest stressors is, what am I going to do? What's my job going to be? So every day we scan 51,000 job databases, and for that veteran, help to shrink down into something that's really tangible based on interest, based on capability. We use some AI to help to match military occupation codes with civilian jobs. And give them the short list of real opportunities that are relevant for them. It's amazing. So this piece of technology, the veterans are really into it. They use this thing 20 minutes a day, which is a lot of time to be on an app. It's not Facebook time during pandemic, but it's a real amount of time that they're connecting with this. And the way that the technology looks and feels is important. A totally different kind of example, and Stuart was talking about living wage and getting people into the workforce. We work with a number of different clients, and Orange County in California is an example of how to deal with this really huge and growing number of homeless people that are in and out of the system, and how do we better engage them in society, better engage them in the workforce. And so what they're doing in Orange County is they're creating a single view of an individual, of these really vulnerable people across government and nonprofit services, so that somebody in the housing knows that a person is receiving behavioral health treatments, or community corrections knows that a person, when they come out of the prison system, is going into housing, is getting the behavioral support services that they need, getting the health care that they need. and the right kind of employment support and benefits and supportive services. And the idea is really to take all this complexity of working with government and with these services and make all of these services work for the individual. Last example I want to talk about is really interesting organization that got started during the pandemic. It's called the Lebanon Relief Organization, and they were addressing the fact that, and it really started with a giant explosion in Beirut in the terminal in about a year ago. And what they were finding was that the relief workers going into Lebanon, the trigger for it was the relief workers going into Lebanon themselves were suffering trauma. But then they started to sort of peel back the story. 80% of Lebanese people have been exposed to trauma in their lifetime. 90% of them have no access to specialized treatment. 71%, amazing number, have experienced war-related trauma in their lifetime. And then 50% of kids in Beirut needed psychological help. So the Lebanon Relief Network came together in the last year. It's a group of specialists from academia, from clinicians, NGOs, corporations, to really take a look at what could be done in Lebanon. And what they did was form a big plan of raising awareness, offering self-help tools, and that's where technology fits in, promoting the need for professional support, and really starting to look at things holistically. But it was amazing. So one of the things that they were able to do was help to put together some self-help tools. In less than 12 weeks, they were able to work through what it was that they wanted to focus on. So basically a set of tools that you can go online, you can assess your symptoms, and it gives you some really simple things that you could be doing to address those symptoms, things that you can do on your own. In the long, the next phase of the project is to, in Lebanon, there's this huge diaspora of people that are around the world, and many of them are therapists, many of them are psychologists, and it's to allow those people to sign up and register to provide support for people back in Lebanon on a volunteer basis. So the idea there is to match this need for resources with people that are willing to volunteer time. Again, not the answer, but it's part of an answer of addressing that mismatch. So the last year has really taught us a lot, and it is possible to move fast. The urgency of the pandemic shows that if we can identify a set of these really burning requirements, we can move fast. How people interact with technology is critical to it being successful. And there's so much that can be done now in environments where you don't have to do this hardcore coding, where things can just be configured and set up quickly. And privacy and security while increasingly important, are also increasingly easy to manage. And so that's my story, Judy. There are real opportunities for technology to fill a gap, and with anything these days, it's really possible to move quickly.
I really love that you've said that, because we think of technology in a certain way. It's advanced us, but then it's distanced us in the midst of this pandemic. So thank you for bringing up how technology can really help people in trauma, both from Lebanon, we all know and love people there, and also for vets whom we know and love so much. And the second point that's so important about what you have brought to this table is the contributions of the private sector, which we really need in this complex in order to build back better in the work world. So thank you so much, Paul, really. And another innovator, quite so, is Dr. Laurie Foster, who's another good friend. We're all friends here. You're seeing a great group on this screen here. Laurie's a professor of industrial organizational psychology at North Carolina State University and the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And she's connected, by the way, to both of our co-sponsors because she's a fellow of SIOP, which is the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, and also the incoming president of the International Association of Applied Psychology that Walter and I are with, and that you will now hear soon our wonderful president speak to. So Laurie is a leader in the emerging field of behavioral science. And it's very important, this has been acknowledged by the UN Secretary General, who's I mentioned before, very supportive of mental health. So Laurie was the behavioral science advisor to the previous Secretary General at the UN and also in the Obama administration. And she's head of behavioral science at a company, Pymetrics, that uses complicated neuroscience and data science, which is very important now at the UN too, to connect talent with job opportunities. So appropriately, her topic is applying psychology to equip public servants for Agenda 2030, connecting work to SDG 16, which is about peaceful societies. Laurie, you're amazing.
Thank you, Judy. Really appreciate the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My title is Applying Psychology to Equip Public Servants for Agenda 2030. And I wanted to begin by pointing out that so many of the SDGs require, on some level, behavioral change. Whether it's behavioral change on the part of people who are working for the UN, outside of the UN, in many aspects and many facets of this world. And one SDG in particular that I'd like to focus on today is 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. If we pick out even a few of the targets around SDG 16, I think it'll become clear that we need to be focusing on behavior in order to accomplish Agenda 2030 in this decade of action. Target 16.3 is about promoting the rule of law at the national and international levels. 16.5, substantially reducing corruptions and bribery in all their forms. So again, requires behavioral change. And 16.6 is developing effective and accountable and transparent institutions at all levels. For today's presentation, I'd really like to focus there, target 16.6. And link this to the contributions that applied psychology can make. There's a rather famous article in Applied Psychology, which was published by Benjamin Schneider in 1987. The title of the article almost says it all: The People Make the Place. And I would argue that if we're looking to develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels, we need to keep in mind that the people make the place. And therefore, the way to do that is to really begin to focus on the people and putting up systems that enable people to be their best selves at work. Interestingly, Benjamin Schneider in this article notes that when we think about the structure, the process, the culture of an organization, these are the outcomes of people. Now, these are not the causes of behavior at work per se. All of this means that in order to promote SDG 16, we need to get people right. And behavioral insights has a strong role to play on getting people right at work. The OECD defines behavioral insights as lessons derived from the behavioral and social sciences, including decision-making, psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, organizational, and group behavior. So as you can see from this definition, this broad umbrella, it's multidisciplinary in nature, and psychology, applied psychology in particular, has a strong role to play. There are lots of different ways in which we can use behavioral insights and applied psychology to equip public servants for Agenda 2030 during this decade of action. I've listed only a few examples here, but there are many more. Everything from screening, hiring, onboarding, and training employees. And we heard one of our previous presenters, for instance, talking about reskilling. We can talk about using applied psychology to improve motivation, staff development, provide feedback. I think we heard Jeff talking earlier about leadership. We can use applied psychology to figure out how to accurately and effectively measure performance in a way that makes sense, to build teams, and to create a sense of psychological safety such that people feel comfortable speaking up and speaking out and making contributions to their workplace in the public sector. We can also use applied psychology to promote organizational change and organizational culture. And again, just a few examples. Stuart talked about job evaluation earlier. We heard about mental health. We heard about increasing agency. Lots of different roles for applied psychology to improve the plight of the public servant. Let's take just one of these examples and drill down. Let's talk about motivation. Now, if we wanted to think about and talk about improving motivation in the public sector amongst public servants, the way that an applied psychologist might go about it is aligned with what Data and Wilinathan might call behavioral design. So there are a lot of different ways to describe this process, but this is one nice way to think about it as define, diagnose, design, and test. So if you tell me, okay, you know, in my government workforce, I've got this problem with motivation, what are we going to do? We might start by really focusing in on defining the problem. Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean when you say there's a problem with motivation? Defining precisely what that means and how to measure it. And this is a point at which applied psychologists would be inclined to question and test our assumptions. Because sometimes our assumptions are spot on and sometimes they can lead us astray. And so really beginning the process by questioning and testing those assumptions, measuring what motivation means in this context is an important first step. We then get into diagnosing what are the behavioral barriers and what are the bottlenecks that might be preventing people from behaving in the way that you would hope to see in the public services workforce. And I will quote a psychologist called Kurt Lewin, who's famous for saying there is nothing so practical as a good theory, and argue that there are a lot of really good theories in applied psychology that in combination with your own observations in the workforce can provide insight into what those barriers, what those bottlenecks might be, and what kinds of interventions might fuel the types of behaviors that you would hope to see more of in the public service, in the workforce. Thirdly, we design an intervention to try to move the needle in the desired direction. And finally, a methodology to test whether or not that intervention works. If it does, we scale it up. If it doesn't, we tweak and try again or try something altogether different. This is this behavioral design process that can be applied across the board. I'm explaining it here in the context of work motivation. So what does applied psychology tell us about work motivation if we're to run with this example? Lots of things, more things than I have time to explain, but a few points that I will highlight is one that I said a moment ago, that we really need to question and test our assumptions before we decide that our problem is indeed a motivation problem. It might be, it might not be. Number two, be aware of the fundamental attribution error. So this is a concept in psychology which says that when we observe somebody else behaving in a certain way, there are two different categories of explanations we might make in our own minds. One is a dispositional explanation. So the reason why they're behaving that way at work has something to do with them, their disposition. Maybe we think they're lazy or they're not motivated. Different category of explanations are situational. Maybe it's something about their environment that's pushing them in one direction or another. The thing is, in psychology, we've observed that people aren't equally likely to make dispositional and situational explanations. As human beings, we're much more inclined to jump to that dispositional explanation, when in reality, sometimes it's people's environment that is pushing them in one direction or another. And as psychologists, we might look at that environment and say, how can we reshape that in a way that might promote the well-being of this individual worker and enhance their performance? Third bullet point, there's more to work motivation than monetary rewards and incentives. Now, I don't want this to come across as money doesn't matter, because as we heard from Professor Stuart Carr at the beginning of the session, money does matter. So that's not the point, but the point is you can't stop there. There is more to work motivation than monetary rewards and incentives, and there are a number of theories that speak to this. Lots of good theories about work motivation, not enough time to go through all of them today. I'll point to one, a macro theory called self-determination theory. And here was a good article that was published in 2017. And it was really outlining the state of the science on self-determination theory. A few points I'll pull out for today's discussion. Number one is that work motivation doesn't just vary in terms of quantity. This person is more motivated than that person. It also varies in terms of quality. And it turns out that there are higher quality forms of motivation and there are lower quality forms of motivation. The way that self-determination theory might explain this is in terms of more autonomous forms of motivation versus more controlled forms. The more autonomous forms of motivation are what I would call higher quality motivation. Those are the kinds of motivation that emanate from within amongst our public services workforce. Whereas the more controlled forms are, yes, you know, you might be able to get me to do something, but it's clear to me that my behavior is being controlled by someone else, and I feel a little bit less ownership over that. That's the kind that's less likely to persist over time when those incentives or when those punishments are gone. The autonomous forms of motivation, the ones that emanate from within, are more likely to persist. Self-determination theory has a lot more to it, but I'll move on for now and point you to this article as a really good resource for those who are interested in learning more. And I'll say, you know, what about that testing phase? Here's an interesting study. This one was published in the Journal of Management about 4 years ago. And it was trying to test out different forms of motivating the workforce. Now, this particular study was conducted at Intel, and it was amongst computer chip manufacturers. So the work was set up so that people worked 12-hour shifts, 4 days in a row, followed by 4 days off, 4 days on, 4 days off. And the problem was to figure out, how do we enhance the motivation of that workforce when they come back to work after 4 days off? So these researchers, it's a really good example of that testing phase of the define, diagnose, test methodology that I talked about, randomly assigned workers to 3 different conditions. So in one condition, on the first day back, they were told, okay, you know, if you can hit this relatively challenging performance goal, then you're going to get a bonus, the equivalent of about $25. A second group was told, if you can hit this relatively challenging performance target, then you're going to get a compliment from your boss at the end of the day. The third group was told, if you can hit the target, then you're going to get a voucher for a pizza for your family. And then they measured the performance of the workforce. Now you can ask yourself, you can guess, you know, which of these 3 incentives worked the best? Well, they measured everybody's performance after the first day back, and they all worked. Each of the 3 incentives increased people's performance. What was really interesting was the next question. Which of these sustains motivation over time? And that's where they saw a difference. Once the incentive was removed after day 1, they looked at performance on day 2, day 3, and day 4. And what they found was the people who had been randomly assigned to the monetary incentive group, their performance actually dipped below what it had been at baseline when there was no incentive whatsoever. The people who received the compliment from the boss, their performance sustained the highest of all of the 3 groups. The pizza voucher was somewhere in between. That compliment from the boss begins to get at what self-determination theory might call relatedness needs. That we as human beings have various needs, needs for autonomy, needs to develop competence, needs for relationships with others. And there are ways to combine incentives to help address those needs such that people will experience more forms of those autonomous types of motivation. Now that's private sector. So what about the public services workforce? And let me say a few words about this before turning things over to Walter, because there's some real momentum. Yes, most of the examples, I would say there are more examples from the private sector historically than there have been applying behavioral insights to government and non-governmental institutions, but there's real momentum heading in this direction. Coming soon, a very nice publication coming out by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, titled Changing Mindsets to Realize the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this is a part of a bigger toolkit that the Division of Public Institutions and Digital Government is coming out with, where they talk about how to promote new mindsets, competencies, behaviors to support the public services workforce in achieving Agenda 2030. Be on the lookout for this one. I have a chapter in there with my colleagues, Joseph Sherlock and Dan Ariely, where we expand on some of the concepts that I'm talking about today. I'll also say that the OECD, this was in 2018, so nearly 3 years ago, mapped out behavioral insights being applied to public policy around the world. And I don't expect you to read the words on this map, but what you can see is there are lots and lots of behavioral insights being applied to public policy across the world. More than 200 institutions, which span institutions inside government, outside of government, as well as multinational organizations like the UN. Judy mentioned at the beginning that I had the pleasure of working in one such team. This was during the Obama administration from 2014 to 2016, the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team. Around 2015, Obama signed an executive order titled Using Behavioral Science Insights to Better Serve the American People. It was really highlighting some of the things I'm speaking about today and how useful applied psychology can be in improving government and non-governmental organizations. And you will notice that there are multinational organizations on this map, including UN entities. A lot of momentum within the UN family around increasing and leveraging strategically our usage of behavioral insights to improve not only governments around the world, but the UN as a system, as an organization. The Joint Inspection Unit in 2019 did a very nice review of change management in UN systems organizations. And if you read that report, you'll see that they highlight areas in which behavioral insights were being applied, as well as the need for greater applications of behavioral science and applied psychology as we look to make sure that our UN entities are fit for purpose for the decade of action. More recently, really just a few weeks ago, the Secretary General came out with a guidance note on applying psychology at the UN, which focused on a variety of different ways in which applied psychology, behavioral science can strengthen the UN system. So I would point you to that if this is an area of interest. And I'll conclude with a quote from the previous Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, which I think speaks volume. It says, behavioral insights research, our organization, our global agenda, and most importantly, the people worldwide they are intended to serve deserve nothing less than the best science available. A human-centered agenda requires a rigorous research-based understanding of people. So to conclude, the people make the place. If we want to strengthen institutions and contribute to the SDGs in that way, getting people right is key, and behavioral science at large, applied psychology in particular, can be an important mechanism for getting people right at work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurie, for those 2 Ps, the people in place. Actually, the UN agenda does have a foundation of 5 Ps. People, peace, which is your SDG 16, and prosperity, which is what we're talking about here, are part of that. So we're really grounded in there. And also, Laurie, for bringing out the issues of applied psychology. What we're learning here so much today is all these brilliant friends and brilliant psychologists and contributors to the world of work are really in these disciplines of applied psychology, humanitarian work psychology, and also behavioral psychology. So it's 3 phrases of the types of psychology that we're learning about here. And no one better to know all about that than our discussant, Dr. Walter Reichman. He's been a moderator of many other things, so now he gets to be the discussant, but he's done a great job, and he wears so many hats that Walter wears. In the private sector, he's a partner and a vice president of Org Vitality. In academia, he's a leader in the field of this humanitarian work psychology that we've heard about, that Stu really founded, and that's evident in his book, which is really brilliant, The Industrial and Organizational Psychology, Help the Vulnerable, Serving the Underserved, which is leaving no one behind, like we do at the UN, really focus on that. With many examples there with entrepreneurship in Uganda and Britain's training of the homeless that we've also heard about today. At the UN, he's the major force in our NGO community as an NGO representative for our International Association of Applied Psychology, the former president of the Psychology Coalition that we've created of NGOs that are accredited to the Economic and Social Council at the United Nations. And he's a major advocate on behalf of decent work, ending poverty, and the rights of disabled persons in work. And Walter, you are amazing. Pull it all together for us.
Thank you, Judy. You're wonderful as always. And I just want to acknowledge the brilliance, the creativity, the work, and the insights of this magnificent panel of my colleagues. It was a joy to listen to you. It's a joy to read you. It's a joy to know you. And I thank you for giving me the privilege of being able to comment on the kinds of things that you have said. It is whatever you say, your thinking, your research, it generates a whole direction of thoughts and ideas. And I'm going to share a little bit of it with you, but there is much more that I've learned from you today and learned from you over the years that I've worked with you. We are in the middle of a pandemic. If you think in terms of the variant, if you think in terms of the rise in cases that are happening in the United States because people are refusing to take the inoculation, if you think about what's happening in India, that they have just closed in Japan for people to be at the games. We are in the middle of a pandemic. And yet, even though we are in the middle of the pandemic, our United Nations has decided to focus on the future, what's going to happen after this. And so they are devoting 10 days of the high-level political forum to look at the future. Not to dwell on what's happening, but to look at the future. And I find that extraordinarily wonderful. And it's within the legacy and the tradition of the United Nations. If you recall, the United Nations was formed, the idea of the United Nations was formed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain, as they were in the middle of the Second World War, at a time when we were losing more military battles than we were winning. With a sense of the future and the sense of hope, they went beyond the Second World War and said, we don't want to put the world back the way it was before the war. We want to put it in a better and a different place. And the concept of the United Nations developed from that. And as we look at what the UN is doing now, and as we look at what our group of presenters this morning are doing, they are doing very much the same thing. They are optimistic for the future, and they're saying, we don't want to put the world back the way it was before the pandemic. We want to put it in a better place than it was and that it is now. And so we see the contributions of each one to this goal and to this purpose. Stuart Carr does not want to bring us back to poverty or sitting on the edge of the precipice where millions of people will fall into poverty. He knows, and we know, that things have gotten worse in terms of finances as a result of the COVID. But where do we want to go from here? And Stu and his colleagues came up with the notion of the living wage. And he talked about when there is no wage, no minimum wage, a minimum wage, and a living wage, and the differences in all of these three elements for the lives and well-being of people. And thank you to New Zealand for pioneering, instituting this as a living test case. When I think of the living wage, and even when I think of the minimum wage, one of the major criticisms that I've heard over the years was that if we raise the minimum wage, if we have a living wage, that companies will not be able to meet those wages, and they will have to go out of business, and the people who are working there will be worse off because they won't have jobs at all. There is some validity and there is some truth in this when you look at the research. But I think the work that Stuart Carr is doing is taking us in a new and more wonderful direction. What he basically is, and his group is saying, is that there is a tipping point. There is a point in society where we can give people a living wage and at the same time maintain the company's existence. And if we can find this tipping point, we will have eliminated a basic problem relevant to poverty and relevant to living a well-being and a decent life. And what I would love to see come out of the research that he's doing is this algorithm that we could provide in different countries, in different sectors of different countries, which will say, this is the living wage that will both maintain the organizations and the businesses and give the workers a sense of well-being and a sense of being able to do the things they have to do to support themselves and their families. Moving from there to my colleague, Jeff Saltzman, he very much picks up on the same theme when he talks about what is going to be expected. What are workers going to expect when they come back after this pandemic? And basically he's saying they're going to expect what everybody expects when they go to work. They're going to expect exactly what they expected when we came out of 9/11. They're going to expect exactly what we came out of the financial crisis of 2008. And that regardless of minor differences, we all basically want the same thing in work and in life. And once again, he points to equity, which now points back to Stuart Carr and the living wage. And Jeff goes into another element of this. He describes equity. He describes the psychology behind experiencing that you are being treated in an equitable manner. What does that mean? It's comparison between you and other people. He goes beyond equity and he talks about respect and dignity and makes the comment that everyone around the world, in their work, in their business, in everything that they do, they want to have a level of respect and a level of dignity. And he points to the organization. He points to the resilience and what makes a good organization and what makes for good leadership that brings back equity, brings back respect and dignity, and comes to some of the conclusions that it's openness, that it's communication, it's being open and fair, taking people into consideration, telling them the truth, and you can develop a sense of communication, the sense of openness and reality, and you can pursue a better life as we come back from the pandemic. But he also points out the fact that there is stress in work. There is stress in the different types of work that we do, the different types of elements that we say, and that it is the role of leadership, it's the role of the organization to somehow damp down the stress and not increase the stress and help people learn how to deal with the stress so it does not become a mental health issue. And the notion of stress and it becoming a mental health issue is a segue into the work of Therese Fitzpatrick and Paul Damo. The work at the UN is absolutely remarkable. As Patrice said, there was a survey done in 2015, much before the pandemic, that indicated that 49% of the employees of the United Nations were describing themselves as having some type of a mental health issue. When the Secretary General saw that, he was appalled by it and decided that something had to be done. And he put together a group that came up with a 5-year plan to reduce and to prevent mental health issues happening within the United Nations. And the plan is online. I read it. I thought it was an absolutely brilliant plan. And from my way of thinking, that becomes a model that every business organization could adapt and use to damp down and reduce, if not eliminate it, mental health issues in the workplace. And as we know, as people come back from the pandemic, there is going to be more mental health issues than there were before. And Therese is the person responsible for implementing this magnificent plan. And her work is, it's the work of a lifetime, the work of a career, and just absolutely magnificent. Read all the material that she suggests. They're eye-opening and educational. She points out something else in the data, and what she showed that kind of struck my interest is that the longer the people were employed at the United Nations, the greater the mental health issues that they had. And while we know there is no correlation, is not causation, we have to take a look at this correlation and look at it in terms of the kinds of things that Jeff said, in terms of management, of leadership, engaging in activities that can engender the stress that can lead to mental health issues. And what occurred to me as I read the work was, would it be possible to use management as a tool to bring people with mental health issues into some kind of treatment? And it occurred to me that one of the things that inevitably happen when you have a mental health issue, your performance suffers. It may not be the number of sales that you make or the number of widgets that you turn out, but it has an effect on your performance, on your absenteeism, your lateness, the level of conflicts you have with other people. If management would monitor just job performance and increase performance to include some of these more subtle things, and then when they have an employee who is showing some of these performance decrements, confront them and say, look, your performance has been going down. We can't tolerate this performance, but I don't know what's causing it, but you have to increase your performance. I would suggest that you go to the employee assistance program, to the medical department, to an outside therapist to see if this will help you. In the meantime, I promise you, we will maintain your job. We will keep your job until you're ready to return and become an effective worker. Perhaps this would be a motivating element, bringing people, when they return to work and are experiencing mental health issues, bringing them into some kind of therapy. And I'm talking, to Paul, saying that 63% of the people with mental health issues never, in fact, tell their employers. They don't know about it. And this increases the level of stigma, and bringing management into the treatment process, the diagnostic process, the motivating process of bringing people into therapy would be a way of reducing stigma. I am turning now to Paul's work, and I find that one of the most exciting pieces of work that's going on. We all know that technology has been just bursting through the world over the past couple of years. We are where we are today because of technology. We're not sitting in a room talking to each other. We're talking to each other from different places. That's technology. You pointed to the advances of technology, and they're probably at its rudiments at this point. We can present some type of information, but I can envision that in the future, through the efforts of artificial intelligence, through the efforts of big data, the degree of technology and the amount of technology will burgeon forward, and hopefully it will be applied to mental health issues and to workplace issues. So we now know, for example, that people who were in therapy during this pandemic have been talking to their therapists online through Zoom. Can you imagine a situation where people in far off countries where there are not enough therapists can go on their cell phone, can dial up and speak to a therapist in another country, in another part of the world, who can provide help to them? Can you see therapists putting in symptoms and coming up with a diagnosis, and along with this diagnosis, some treatment drug ideas or treatment ideas for people. The future of technology in bringing mental health issues is burgeoning. And as Judy said, the private sector has to play a major part in this. IBM and other of these technology organizations, the future of mental health, the future of well-being, the future of coming back at a better place than we are now is really very much in the arms of the technology coming out of the private sector. Talking to Laurie Foster, phenomenal work. What I'm reading, what I'm hearing from the work that she herself has done at the White House and at the UN is we are applying psychology, behavioral science, organizational psychology to the process of developing policies and implementing policies. And as we come back from the pandemic, as we try to bring forward the kinds of suggestions that have been made here today. So for example, if we're going to institute the living wage as a process, there's going to have to be government involvement in setting up this as a process. There's going to have to be the input from labor unions, the input from management organizations. And in terms of developing policy and in implementing policy and motivating people to in fact bring the policy to life, the behavioral sciences will be absolutely essential in bringing this forward. And then a segue from that, the United Nations can certainly use the work of behavioral scientists. At this point, there are 10 international psychology associations that are accredited to ECOSOC. Their one purpose in existence at the United Nations is to bring our science and best practices to the United Nations. And for those of you who are in the audience who are part of the Secretariat, and those of you who are in the audience who in fact are part of the missions, make use of us. We are there to work with you, to help you, and we can apply the same kind of creativity, insight, and best practices that have been described this morning. We can provide it to help you bring the SDGs into existence and to bring us to a world that we want, a world that will be better than it was before our pandemic occurred. Thank you all for this opportunity. Thank you.
I think you can tell that Walter's dream when he was a little boy was to be at the United Nations. And now he is making a big difference there. So bless you for that. And for summarizing so well and synthesizing all of our amazing speakers. And we are so indebted to our great leader, our president of the International Association of Applied Psychology, Dr. Christine Roland-Levy, who will wrap this all up with us with some closing remarks, who is really also bringing the applied psychology concept that Walter mentioned and Laurie mentioned to show how much contribution there is from psychologists to the United Nations. So thank you so much for that. And she is an innovator in starting the journal, The Applied Psychology Around the World, that you should look at on the internet, as a professor of social psychology in France, where she comes to us from. She's very involved in the world of work, overseeing IAP's divisions of economic psychology and work psychology, and having been president of the International Association for Research in Economic Psychology, and focusing her research now on risk-taking and well-being in the workplace, very important. Her outstanding achievements, by the way, in academia were acknowledged that she was given an award, the Distinguished Order of the Psalms. I don't know if she's wearing her badge now, but oh, okay, there it is. Bestowed by France to distinguished professors, which she is, originally established by Napoleon. Christine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judy, for your kind words. Thank you to all of you. I'll start with that. I'll go very quickly with those closing remarks because we're a little behind time, but still there are a few words that I wish to say. First of all, what a wonderful session, what a fascinating session. And this is really, I think, very important and very innovative in a way. It is clear for me that from today, despite the tragedy of the ongoing pandemic in many parts of the world, we still have hope thanks to this event. Hope that we are going to be able to contribute to more decent work. I think that we have learned today quite a lot from each other, thanks to the contributions, to the recommendations, including about technology, as we heard, contributions from work psychologists in particular, thanks to their scientific knowledge and behavioral science. I think all this will be of great benefit for all of us. Today, we have heard that there is hope for more decent work if we base it on, as it was reminded by Walter, equity, respect, dignity, and try to have a future, think of a meaningful career for all. And we also had heard the idea of the potentially living wages, which maybe not there yet, but it's a goal that we're aiming at. So maybe a takeaway message here is that mental health and well-being for all can contribute more to decent work. And this is crucial in order to achieve the UN SDGs that we have heard about today. I'm convinced that the area of research to achieving decent work for resilient and sustainable recovery from COVID-19, things and points that we have shared today will help our world recover and build back better after COVID-19 for a world with more fairness, more justice in the workplace, a world that leaves no one behind. We all deserve decent work. As president of the International Association of Applied Psychology, a co-sponsor of this event, I express sincere appreciation to my colleagues from the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, SIOP, and from Org Vitality, also co-sponsors of this event. Thank you all for making this session a very stimulating one. And before closing, I wish to include my personal thanks to Walter Reichman, first of all, for the great discussion he made, but also for making this event possible. So thank you all. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Judy. Thank you all very much. That's it.
As we wrap up, blessings to everybody. We've had our mind fed, but also our hearts with a lot of metaphors about grit and glow and rainbows even. And then thank you, Christine, about hope. So bless you all. And thank you as we move to build back better.